Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of November 22nd, 2020. Today, we will have a stimulating conversation on the roots of technological and societal progress and how we could possibly accelerate it and overcome some of the tendencies towards stagnation in various fields in our era. First, I will introduce our U.S. Transhumanist Party panel. I am Gennady Stolirov II, the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. With me are David Shoemaker, our Director of Applied Innovation, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Visual Art, and Dan Elton, our Director of Scholarship. And our guest for today is Jason Crawford. Jason Crawford is an expert in the field of progress studies, which is an emerging discipline. He has a website at rootsofprogress.org, which has a lot of fascinating content, including a recent post, which I think will resonate with a lot of our viewers, where Jason reviews a new book by J. Storrs Hall called Where's My Flying Car? And this post is called Progress, Stagnation, and Flying Cars. I'm sure we members of the U.S. Transhumanist Party have wondered for a while why that particular radiant prediction of future advancement that existed as far back as the 1950s has not yet materialized. So the discipline of progress studies aims to shed some light on that question and on various others. So welcome, Jason. And to start off, tell us how you got involved with progress studies, what interested you in this field, and why you believe it's important for us to pursue this discipline today.
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me here. Great to speak to you all. My background is actually mostly in computer technology and software. My degree is in computer science. I spent 18 years as a software engineer, engineering manager, and tech startup co-founder. Been in the San Francisco Bay Area for the last 10, 11 years now. And I got interested in progress as a personal project, sort of a side project. Almost 4 years ago, in early 2017, it began as just a reading list. I just started reading books about the Industrial Revolution and various aspects of human progress, with a personal intellectual goal of coming to understand the story of human progress and then trying to relate it to current issues of society and politics. I turned the reading list into a blog, and then over the course of a couple of years, I built up an audience until middle of last year. The blog actually became, I started to break out into the wider world. I got, I had my first blog post go viral and started to grow the audience. Around the same time, some people may have noticed there was an article that ran in The Atlantic titled "We Need a New Science of Progress," and it was written co-authored by Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison. Tyler Cowen's an economist at George Mason University and head of the Mercatus Center there, runs the blog Marginal Revolution and the podcast Conversations with Tyler. And Patrick Collison, of course, is the co-founder and CEO of Stripe, a very successful Silicon Valley startup, which is now worth in the tens of billions of dollars as of their last valuation. So the two of them wrote this article calling for a new field or interdisciplinary area of progress studies, saying that progress is understudied and we need to study it more in order to figure out how to get more of it. And so a community grew up around, I would say, sort of galvanized by that article. A bunch of people reacted to this, and I think now that we had a word for it, a lot of people were able to come together and realize that we were all interested in this topic, and we just didn't know about each other because there wasn't a name for what we were all doing or what we were all interested in. And soon after that, I decided to leave the tech job that I was at, and as I was looking for my next what I was going to spend the next phase of my career on, I decided that the thing I was most interested in was studying and writing about progress. So I went full-time on the blog. And so as of a little over a year ago, I've been writing Roots of Progress full-time and working on other related projects. So that's how I got into this.
Yes, thank you for that overview. And it is indeed noteworthy to emphasize how new the discipline of progress studies is, even though the phenomena to which it is responding have had quite an extensive history in Western civilization. There has, of course, long been gradual technological progress, even during the so-called Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, but there was a dramatic acceleration during the Renaissance of the 15th century, and then in the 18th century with the Age of Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. And in the 20th century, there was a period of massive progress, where, as many have observed, during a 60-year time span between the Wright brothers' first flight and the early 1960s, essentially, humankind went from not having powered flight at all to going into space. And nonetheless, since that time, in certain sectors, there seems to have been a certain stagnation and even decline. I have heard that essentially the U.S. couldn't replicate the Apollo program today, even if everybody wanted to do it. Some of the industrial manufacturing capacity that produced the rockets that took humans to the moon essentially is no longer here. It would have to be built from scratch, and that would take time. So tomorrow, if the President of the United States ordered everybody to devote as many resources as possible to flying to the moon, it still couldn't be done right away or in a short period of time. So something happened between the 1970s and today. And this is of concern to a lot of us transhumanists, because the pace of technological progress, we remain alive for longer than a typical human lifespan. This applies to progress as well. So what do you think are some of the causes of this stagnation in certain areas?
Yeah. I have three main working hypotheses right now, which are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I think they're all contributing at different levels and they interact. The most fundamental is cultural and philosophic attitudes towards progress. I think the world at large, and the West in particular, was much more enthusiastic about and positive towards progress and the technological future, say 50 to 100 years ago. Certainly around the end of the 19th century and going into the 20th, people saw technology and science as a very positive force. That doesn't mean that every advance was welcomed with open arms. In fact, quite the opposite. Every technological advance in history pretty much has been fought and opposed, no matter when it was introduced or what people's general views were. But the general views on progress matter. And I think certainly in America, I think more broadly in the West, views towards progress and technology and industry and capitalism soured in the middle of the 20th century. And I think the world wars probably significantly contributed to this. I think the rise of the counterculture was sort of the ideological and philosophical explanation and response to that historical and other historical phenomena. And so by the end of the 60s, the rise of the environmentalist movement, there's at least a contingent of that movement, which is very much anti-technology, down with progress, back to nature, we're killing ourselves, we're killing the planet, etc. Hypothesis number two is about the burden of regulation and bureaucracy. Most of this is about, I would say, government regulation and the sort of regulatory structure that we've built up. Although I think it's not exclusively about that. I think you see a lot of bureaucracy and overhead of rules, even within private organizations. Look at any large company or university and how difficult it is to get things done, within there. And I think a part of this is also a sort of cultural element, which is a safety culture in which the safety argument trumps everything. You can win any argument by saying that it is for safety, and you can stop any project by declaring it unsafe. And there's no real discussion that we can have about risk-reward trade-offs or things that have a benefit, even if they have a safety, even if they have risks. And so I think that has taken us to a place where we not only have, let me be clear, the creation of enormous amounts of safety in many ways is an enormous achievement of the Industrial Revolution and more generally of progress, technological and scientific progress. I think we are much safer in many ways than we used to be, if not in every way. And we may have created some enormous tail risk at the same time that we were reducing many everyday risks, but still we did reduce many everyday risks, and we need to give credit for that where due. However, I think it is quite possible to get into a situation where an excessive emphasis on safety and no consideration of cost benefit trade-offs leads you to safety theater, where you have gone beyond any reasonable conception of ROI and have added a lot of things, rules, regulations, and overhead that do not actually buy you much safety, but do buy you a lot of, that do contribute a lot of friction. Hypothesis number 3, and the final one I'll add here, is about the way that we fund, organize, and manage research and science. And in particular, I am worried about the general centralization and bureaucratization of science funding in this country and more generally in the West. The U.S. federal government pretty much took over science funding after World War II, and there are, to my opinion, some compelling arguments that this has, even perhaps without intending it, perhaps completely opposite to intentions, that this has limited scientific freedom and led to too much consensus and groupthink in what projects get the green light and what we actually get to do, and therefore that there's that we have accidentally blocked, and I'll give the benefit of the doubt and say accidentally blocked the kind of contrarian, maverick ideas and projects that we need to get real breakthroughs. So those are the 3 main hypotheses.
Yes, thank you. And I agree that all 3 of these issues are contributing factors to the decline of progress. Now, what are some of your ideas regarding solutions for this conundrum? How do we untangle the Gordian knot or cut through it?
Yeah. So to simply, take each one of them and talk a little bit about what could be done at the culture level, I think we need to start with history, and that's why most of my work is on the history of progress. I think that story has not been told. It is not, it certainly has not been told in an accessible way that has been broadly popularized, and so I think someone needs to do that, and I'm working on it. I think this needs to be worked into education. And by the way, some of my work right now is working on educational curricula at the high school level. I'm working with a private high school that is incorporating material that I'm developing. We launched it this summer as a summer program. Many students went through, and then we are working on it now as they're incorporating it into their high school curriculum. So that's a current project. I think it also needs to get done at the university level as well. And I think there needs to be broad public outreach. One of my main projects coming up soon is I'm preparing to work on a book, which I intend to be a popular history of progress and with commentary on the philosophy of progress. I think we need this, journalists need to understand the history and philosophy of progress and work it into the way that they write about science, technology, and business. I think that people who create various forms of art and entertainment, especially movies, which are the and science fiction, which are the kind of the main forms of artistic communication today. I think we need more people putting forth positive visions of the future and with a positive view, at least, of human agency. So that's on the cultural level. And by the way, I think when you think about cultural outreach, you can think about it in 2 ways, or at least 2 ways. You can think about broad outreach to sort of the public at large. You can also think about more targeted outreach. And in my opinion, the absolute most important thing to do is to reach a targeted audience of the scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs who are actually going to make the next set of breakthroughs. If there's going to be if we're going to reverse stagnation in the next 50 years, who is going to do it and who is actually going to lead the way? And so I think one of the most important things we can do is actually communicate this message to those people and to give them motivation, to give them inspiration and courage. to let them know that progress can be tremendously beneficial for humanity and to help guide them in how to do so. So that's at the cultural level. At the political level, I think we need to unwind the regulatory state. I think we need better solutions than these large centralized bureaucracies. I think the obvious example today is the FDA. The FDA has gotten themselves, or we have gotten ourselves into a situation where when a COVID vaccine is ready, the FDA says, we'll review this in 3 weeks' time and see if we're going to grant your emergency use authorization. I think we've gotten ourselves, so coming back to the safety theater argument, I think we've gotten ourselves into a situation where FDA approval is essentially binary. Whereas this is the exact opposite of the reality of uncertainty and risk around medical decisions and treatments. Medical decisions are like the quintessential example of the need to make informed decisions in a context of uncertainty and imperfect information. This is true both at the public health level and it is true at the level of each individual patient. And pretty much everything about our medical system is very much works against the best practices for making informed decisions in conditions of uncertainty. The way doctors interact with patients does not acknowledge this and does not give agency or grant any sort of intelligence or decision-making ability to the patient. And at the level of culture, the way the FDA makes decisions also does not at all, I think, or only in very small ways that are wholly inadequate, does it grant that decisions can and need to be made in conditions of uncertainty. So we've reached the point where the FDA cannot say anything. They are, because of the way they are set up in the culture and the way people think about them, the FDA cannot effectively say anything other than this drug or treatment is virtually 100% guaranteed and safe, and everybody can take it immediately and so forth. Again, I'm exaggerating slightly. There is such a thing as emergency use authorization. There is such a thing as compassionate use and so forth. But I think these things are just, they don't go nearly, as far as they should. So we're in this situation where all drugs have to go through these extensive trials. It's very difficult to get experimental access to things. Et cetera and so forth. So we need to unwind that somehow. And I don't have a great program for how to do it. I think it starts with building more of an intellectual coalition around the concept. And so that's why I think it's almost premature for large scale political action. Not that I wouldn't support specific campaigns that I thought had a good experience of succeeding. But I think the time right now is ripe to build a sort of intellectual movement and coalition, and maybe somewhat down the line that can build into more of a political movement. But I just think, there may be an ability to build political movements around specific issues that are broadly acknowledged today as massive problems facing society. The biggest one perhaps would be climate change, but even there, a pro-science, pro-technology sort of ambitious future for climate change is very difficult. If you go out there and say we're going to do geoengineering, we're going to do carbon capture, we're going to do nuclear energy, we're going to do sort of all these things. We're going to, if you read my review of Where Is My Flying Car, he talks about putting a fleet of some number of quintillion, tiny aerostats built through nanotechnology, and putting a fleet of them in the atmosphere, and they're all remote controlled with little mirrors so that we can capture sunlight or reflect it or direct it to certain part, something insanely ambitious like that. It's just not even in the conversation. And in fact, you'll even get an enormous amount of ideological pushback if you suggest any sort of geoengineering or anything at all that suggests that we don't need to ascetically reduce consumption and essentially roll back, industrial civilization to some degree. So I think that's a really difficult political cause right now. And that's why I say, again, I feel the time is more ripe for an intellectual movement that will lay the groundwork for a political one. At the level of funding and organization, you could do a couple of different things. One is you could try to work within the public sort of sphere of, again, so political types of things. You could try to reform the NIH and the NSF and the way things, you could try to maybe promote more of a DARPA model if you believe in that. There are some interesting things going on here. Maybe the most interesting I've seen is something that came out of the Day One project. Adam Marblestone is promoting an idea called focused research organizations, or FROs, and I think that's an interesting idea that might be a better way of funding some research efforts. There are different. I think that's mostly being promoted right now in as something to be done within government, but you could also imagine it being done within private, in a private nonprofit way, or even potentially in a for-profit way. The other way you can approach this is from the private sector, and you could try to either influence or just start on your own some form of nonprofit or for-profit funding for research that would avoid the problems of consensus and groupthink, and would allow for more scientific and academic freedom, intellectual freedom in what people pursue. There's a very interesting book that just came out, which I'm only a chapter into, but it is titled Scientific Freedom, The Elixir of Civilization. It was published actually some decades ago and was recently republished by Stripe Press. It talks in there about an interesting model called venture research. But I haven't finished the book yet, so I can't tell you all about it. But I would just say that I think that's an interesting model that maybe someone could pursue privately. So those are the types of things that I think we could do at each of those different levels. Make no mistake, this is a long-term effort. This is the sort of thing that is measured in decades, not even years or quarters. So
yes,
buckle in.
Thank you for that discussion, Jason. I agree it's a long-term effort, but we do have to start somewhere, and
Absolutely.
That's the key. Now, the U.S. Transhumanist Party is relatively young. We were founded in 2014. I became chairman in 2016. Our goal essentially is to shift that Overton window of the public discourse, particularly in politics, but not necessarily limited to that, to facilitate greater acceptance of technological progress and a greater role for technological progress in policy conversations. So I'm fairly realistic about our near-term prospects and that we're likely not going to have someone elected to office. But my outlook is just by being in the conversation, just by proposing measures that other political parties, even the libertarians, won't necessarily discuss. For instance, removal of the FDA barriers to medical research. That doesn't seem to be a huge emphasis of the Libertarian Party platform, even though a lot of libertarians would be sympathetic to it. Somehow the libertarians tend to discuss valid issues like marijuana legalization to a greater extent than how to accelerate technological progress. So it does seem to me that there is room for an incipient transhumanist political organization that brings these kinds of ideas into a different realm from the academic realm. Because some people follow politics, they don't necessarily follow academia, they don't necessarily read intellectual blogs, but they might pay attention if a journalist interviews a transhumanist candidate like Charlie Cam, who ran in the 2020 presidential election. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And so just for audience context, when we were discussing, setting this up, I mentioned that I checked you all out and read some of your values and platform statement. And actually, let me just say first off, the thing I really appreciate about this group and the way that you think about the world and the future is the technological ambition of your vision for the future, which I share, and which I think is also was a big theme of that book, Where is My Flying Car? So I do recommend you read that book review that I posted recently, and then you'll probably enjoy the book as well. When I look out there at different technological visions of the future, there's one vision which is sort of the maybe the deep ecology type, or a I'll call it the degrowth, because there's actually something called a degrowth movement that basically sees technological and industrial progress as an unhealthy addiction, that we've gone way too far. We've gone into a world that's completely unsustainable, and we're just, like a glutton gorging on some abundance of food that's going to run out, or that is going to kill us, or something like that. And so their prescription for the future is to take a step back, at least, right, and to kind of roll things back a little bit. Step back from this incessant grasping for more and the exponential growth, which of course cannot continue, they say, and so forth, and just kind of slow down, find stasis, and be a little more comfortable in what I would call stagnation, right? Not really going anywhere, but just kind of, sustainability, right? So sustainability in this notion that if nothing ever really changes and we just kind of stay where we are, and the population can level off and energy usage can level off, and we find sustainable, renewable energy, and that, that somehow all the risks will be over and everything will be okay and will be safe and comfortable, as long as we don't get too greedy and ambitious. That's one vision for the future. There's another vision for the future, which is more favorable to science and technology, thinks that we can actually make the world better through those things, not worse. But when you look at the goals that some people embrace, they essentially are things like, I think of them largely as the negation of negatives: stop climate change, end cancer, eliminate poverty, these kinds of things. All of these are essentially to take bad things that are happening to some people, or maybe bad things that are going to happen to all of us, and just make them not happen. There isn't a vision of let's extend lifespan beyond natural limits. There's just a vision of, well, let's let everybody live to the natural limits, right? And there's a vision of take poor people and bring them up to the current best standard of the world, but there's no vision of take everybody and move them even way beyond the best standard of the world, just as has in fact been done over the last 200 years, and so forth. So I embrace a much more ambitious, positive, vision of the future that we can. And my number one message, really, to the world is look at the last 250 years. We were desperately poor back then compared to where we are today, and we should consider ourselves desperately poor now compared to where we can be 50, 100, or 200 years in the future if we can keep progress going. And that is the big vision that we should all be enthusiastically working towards. And I think you all are some of the few who actually see and share that. And that was one of the things I also, again, liked about the book, Where's My Flying Car? So I think that is like the number one thing. Okay, so having said that, I did say to the organizers of this that I didn't agree with the strategy, and I don't feel that now is the time for a political party. And so I thought it would be interesting to discuss this. I agree with the general idea of kind of getting the conversation, move the window, although I frankly wouldn't say that I exactly know how Overton windows are moved. And I'm not convinced that they're moved by saying things that are outside of them, although maybe they are. I don't know. It's an interesting question to discuss. In general, though, I just wonder if there are other ways to be in the conversation and to get attention that don't have the overhead of being a political party, which has certain requirements and regulations and costs and so forth, and also B, there's just sort of a risk that people look at the sort of discrepancy between what most people are going to imply is the goal of a political party, which is to actually elect candidates and so forth. And then if you don't elect any candidates, I think there's a risk that people look at you and say, well, these guys aren't effective because they're not electing candidates. And if you then say, wait, oh, that wasn't even really our goal is just to be in the conversation, there's a risk that people don't hear that second part, right? And so I wonder if you'd actually even be more effective at being in the conversation if you were if the form and structure of what you were doing was kind of more directly aimed at the stated goal of get ideas out there. There are other types of organizations that get ideas out there. So anyway, those are just some thoughts from my end, and be happy to hear how you all think about strategy. You've obviously thought about it a lot more than I have.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for sharing those thoughts, Jason. Now, in terms of the overhead, we have thought about that a lot, and we have tried to find ways to deftly dodge as many of the compliance requirements as we could by essentially not utilizing the kinds of resources whose utilization catches the eye of the regulators. So, for instance, what is really regulated in American politics is campaign finance, contributions, and expenditures. So we figured out if you don't have any of those, then you're not obligated to even file the paperwork. And there may even be a little more flexibility to use small amounts of money, an area we're looking at, but we haven't made any sorts of decisions. But essentially, the Transhumanist Party is what you get when you take money out of politics. And this has been the organization we've been able to achieve, the reach that we have been able to achieve. Admittedly, we would like a much greater reach. And that is a question going forward. Is there a way for us to utilize more resources other than just what our members own, what we're able to freely do online, our conversations with the media, and reach a greater segment of the public? We think the greatest obstacle right now is a sheer awareness gap with regard to these ideas. A lot of people still have this status quo bias where they think the world is largely going to stay the way it is with perhaps some incremental changes, but the radical transformational possibilities that transhumanism offers are just not known to many people. They're known to a decent number of people in media and academia, and even a greater proportion of politicians compared to the general public. But the ordinary person who may have multiple day jobs, who may be struggling to feed their family, who has a lot more immediate concerns, still often is not even aware of what transhumanism means. So that's a challenge. But in terms of being in the conversation, we generally find when we articulate these ideas to the broader public, the only real resistance comes from hardline ideologues on either the left or the right. And I would say these days more so on the left. But ordinary people are mildly receptive. Sometimes they think the ambitions are maybe unrealistic within a short-term time frame, but they don't fundamentally challenge the desirability of this kind of progress. So I think this is a better situation than if the entire society were deep ecologists, for example, or Christian fundamentalists. But we don't have that many of those apart from some fairly fringe circles. So we do think there's a route to eventual mainstream acceptance of the transhumanist platform if we can build up our infrastructure while still remaining a fairly modest influence on the broader conversation. However, we are seeing how terribly the two major parties are behaving in American politics today. And one of the possible scenarios is that one of them will just implode and essentially commit suicide. There are certainly many ways by which that could happen. And as a result, a vacuum could form, and something would need to be able to step into that vacuum. And that could happen in 4 years, it could happen in 8 years, it could happen in 20 years. So we don't know when that will happen. But there is a possibility that if we're ready for that kind of expansion of our role, we could become a major political party at that time. If people are looking for a more positive, constructive, hopeful vision of the future, they don't find it in the mainstream. And so they look to something else. And sometimes in periods of history that have been turbulent like this one, say the antebellum United States or the Weimar Republic in Germany, people have resorted to very simplistic or populist kinds of answers. Autocrats, for example, or say the Confederacy in the South, which was a near totalitarian government. But there's a possibility that something better could fill that void if we prepare the groundwork for that. And that may indeed take years, if not decades.
And why is the I agree with I agree with the notion that I think it's certainly true if you look at history that political change can happen very rapidly in rare times, sort of a punctuated equilibrium almost. And that only happens when the ideological and intellectual groundwork has been laid for some decades in advance. But why? So why the form of a political party versus other ways of getting ideas out there, such as writing books and articles, writing a blog, making videos, a YouTube series, making movies, teaching, making educational materials to be used in schools, all sorts of different ways to get ideas out there and be part of the conversation. Why not focus on those things rather than something that takes the form of a political party?
I suppose my answer would be that is a great proportion of the activity within the transhumanist movement, and it has been for decades. And certainly it has laid the groundwork for us to even get to this stage where transhumanism is beginning to take on the attributes of a movement rather than just a circle of intellectuals, which it was, say, in the 1990s. But since Zoltan Istvan attempted to popularize transhumanism in 2015 via his Immortality Bus tour, there has been increasing attention from laypersons. And as I said, there's still not enough attention, but there is this inkling that a lot of us have that this is more than just an academic or intellectual pursuit anymore, that it has to be broadened to reach the general public. And another problem, of course, is there are political obstacles, as you mentioned. The FDA is here. The FDA takes 3 weeks under the most rapid review timeframe possible for a vaccine that is 95% effective when over 1,000 people a day are dying of COVID-19. And that, I think, to a rational person just looking at that situation would seem to be unconscionable. If the company says it's 95% effective, why not allow people the opportunity to try this vaccine, given that these mRNA vaccines are known to be fairly safe, and certainly the risk of dying from COVID-19 is much greater. So there is this concept in transhumanism called the proactionary principle, as opposed to the precautionary principle, which I think is very important to engage in the political discourse. And this is actually one of my hopes. If within the next 4 years we can start getting some significant changes to FDA policy and other regulatory policy around the approval of new technologies, new medicines, I would say that would be an immense win, even if we don't elect an office holder ever. Dan, it looks like you want to say something.
Well, I just want to explain the way I see the USTP is Zoltan Istvan, who ran in 2012 or 2016, sorry, he sort of proved that this can work, because while he was very controversial and some people within the Transhumanist Party really balked at his kind of libertarianism and some of his really weird policies, overall, I think his campaign was very successful in just spreading the concept, kind of spreading awareness of that transhumanism even exists, as and getting people to think about what would be possible with say biotechnology if we invested more in it. And now he had a lot of prior experience with working in the media, because he worked at National Geographic, and he already had some stature, so that helped him. It definitely helped him get into a lot of press. But what he was able to show is basically the presidential campaign is a vehicle to get into the news if you do it right. So that's a big thing that we were trying to replicate this cycle. Mm-hmm. And we weren't as successful as he was, but I think we did get some attention through it.
Yes, and I think I can explain what kind of led us not to reach the same level of media exposure as Zoltan. This was an election season where much of the mainstream media intentionally blocked out coverage of third parties, including even the libertarians. So whereas previously they would give some airtime to Zoltan, they would give airtime to Gary Johnson, they didn't give much airtime to anybody. We had a debate that we collaborated with the Free and Equal Elections Foundation and opened the debates on in early March in Chicago, March 4th. And this was a debate where we had 18 candidates from 8 different political parties, as well as some independent candidates participating in 2 sessions discussing policy. Unlike the Trump-Biden debates, these were completely civil, even though the candidates spanned the entirety of the conventional political spectrum and some had unconventional positions. They were still all completely respectful to one another. And it was a great substantive discussion, yet no mainstream media outlets covered it. Only a few alternative media outlets covered that debate. Although even Zoltan was there. He ran in the Republican primary against Donald Trump, and I think he did a great job at that debate. And yet there seems to have been this intentional blackout because so many people in the media thought the number one priority is to defeat Trump, and anybody who might possibly take away votes from the Democratic nominee should be de-emphasized. And in my view, that's not the role of the media. The media should be objective in its coverage. And yet, unfortunately, the media have become ideological in the United States. So that's one reason.
I just
go ahead,
say,
Dan.
Well, it is the media was, I think, following the trend of greater political polarization, which sees anyone who votes for a third party as betraying their, one of the two sides. And so I also noticed that third parties did not seem to be getting as much coverage. I seem to remember the third party debates got a lot more coverage last cycle. So that's actually a major problem. And of course, the lack of ranked choice voting also causes that.
Yes. So just for some background, because Dan mentioned it, we are advocates of electoral reform as well. So we see some significant changes in the electoral system as being necessary to advance our vision. And we utilize ranked preference voting internally. We're very pleased that Maine and Alaska now have adopted that method for their own elections. And we also support electronic voting, hopefully with some sort of security built in as blockchain-based systems allow. We support holding all primaries on the same day. We support proportional representation. We support essentially any policies that eliminate this lesser evil dynamic. We also consider the Electoral College to be obsolete. We'd rather have a single nationwide ranked preference vote, and then each voter would have the same ability to influence the outcome of the election. So these are some ideas we advocate in addition to the technological vision. And I think by being a political party, we have the option to talk about this broader umbrella of concepts. So instead of just saying, oh, we want these technological advances, we can say, yes, we do. We also recognize the structural issues that we discussed. We recognize the cultural and attitudinal issues, and we have some specific ideas for policies and reforms that we will try to advocate when we have the chance. So what are your thoughts on that approach, Jason?
It's interesting. I think that it still seems to me that if I were doing this, I would still be approaching it as we want to get ideas out there and convince. Well, okay, there's a couple things you can do. One is you can work at the idea level, and you can say we're going to popularize certain ideas, and the way you do that is through intellectual material in various forms in media, right? Whether it's writing, whether it's speaking, video, whatever, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you sort of get ideas out there. another thing you can do is you can work at the policy and program level. You can say, all right, we're going to try to fix one targeted thing. Here is the thing that's wrong, and that many people can see is wrong, and here is our prescription for how to fix it. And then you go deep on that, and you actually get experts in that field to really study it in depth and come up with some sort of credible plan. And I think you need in each of these you need a theory of change. So with ideas, you need a theory of how do ideas change. And so that's one thing I was wondering about as you were talking about getting ideas out there. And for instance, if you run a candidate, then the media will cover you perhaps, or they used to, or, whatever. And you were talking about getting ideas out to the sort of broad public and whether the broad public is sympathetic to these ideas when they hear them and so forth. And so one thing that would be interesting to discuss is kind of like, how do ideas actually get out? How do they start from a very small number of intellectual leaders and then become almost common wisdom? And I think that it happens in multiple stages. I don't think it is sort of broadcast directly from an original intellectual founder to the world and then kind of gets accepted. I think it goes through different stages of culture where there's a subset of people who really take ideas seriously and who try their best to have the right ideas, understand them, work out their implications, are willing to reject conventional wisdom and so forth, right? And I think the folks in this room and on this call are in that category. But we're a minority, and most people operate somewhat differently, and I think are much more influenced by what they hear in school growing up, what they hear from their parents, what is in popular culture in terms of media and entertainment and so forth. And so I think it takes a couple of levels, at least 2 levels and maybe more of ideas kind of going through the culture from intellectual founders, either in academia or outside of it, and then to a level of people who take ideas seriously and will apply them to specific areas, and then maybe from there to kind of the public at large. If you want to work, so that's at the idea level. If you want to work at the policy level, you also need a theory of change. And I think that those theories of change are very specific to the kind of policy that you're trying to get done. So if you want to reform the FDA, you have to have a theory about how that might happen. And what forces there are, what levers you can pull, what forces are working against you, how you will counter them and so forth, right? If you want to get electoral reform done, that's a different type of thing that needs its own domain-specific theory of change. And I'm not enough of an expert in any one of those areas to sort of know what the right approach is. I think there are some sorts of things where the domain-specific theory of change involves a broad-based kind of movement where you do need to appeal to the public. I think there are others where maybe you don't. And the way you do it is through actually academic treatises that then get communicated to staffers on Capitol Hill, and then a bill gets passed, and it doesn't really go through kind of a public opinion poll. But again, I'm not enough of an expert in any one of those domains to really kind of say which is which. Is that helpful?
Yes, I think it's worthwhile to consider how change happens and historically has happened in a variety of fields, and also try out various approaches. One of the approaches that we are in the incipient stages of attempting is that of working groups. So we would have a working group of a few individuals, around 5, with perhaps some others providing auxiliary input, that are focused in depth on a particular area. It could be writing a white paper on a policy issue, or it could even be implementing some sort of IT project, like creating a game that might illustrate a particular concept. And then we'd have U.S. Transhumanist Party branding on it. And not only would this product solve a particular problem or increase public awareness in a particular area, but it would also get our name out there.
Yeah, I think the transhumanist movement should be looking at all of the things you just mentioned. Well, and so we have some people that are taking the approach you said of kind of working in academia. There is an organization called Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, founded by James Hughes, which is a little bit more techno-progressive than it has sort of a techno-progressive bent. But they are essentially like a kind of like published journal articles and things on transhumanist ideas. That does not seem to be as active as it used to be. The other thing I wanted to mention is, and then you have Humanity Plus, which I'm sure you've heard of, which also is not as active as it used to be. They used to publish a magazine, for instance, called H Plus, and still a great organization, but it's sort of a shadow of what it was, say, maybe 5-10 years ago. Then the last thing I wanted to mention, which is perhaps the one is most interesting to think about now, is this movement called the Extropian movement. And recently, they a lot of their magazines that they published in the 90s were put online. So I was looking at those recently, and so with the Extropian movement, someone Max Moore and this other guy,
Tom Morrow.
Tom Morrow.
Yes, that was the pseudonym for Tom Bell, I believe.
Yeah, Tom W. Bell, who is going by the name Tom Morrow. They started this Extropian movement, which actually grew to be fairly large in California and San Francisco Bay Area, and they have big conferences and stuff. And they had this magazine with a circulation of maybe a few thousand, but that was shut down, I think around
2005.
2005. Okay.
Yes, the Extropian
So
Institute.
we've had some organizations, but they're sort of on the decline, I would say.
Yes, and it's interesting, Dan.
And so, yeah, and I'm wondering why that is. But I think if we look at the Extropians, that's the kind of thing I would like to see revitalized, that kind of social organization as opposed to political organization.
Well, Dan, I explicitly consider myself an Extropian. I actually hold to that original vision to a much greater extent than many in the contemporary transhumanist movement. The Extropians flourished in the 1990s, and they were a very techno-optimistic group of people. They actively sought ways to accelerate technological progress. This was the community from where the proactionary principle came, as articulated by Max Moore. But I am finding many of the same people are a lot less active now in those areas than they used to be. And it seems like, Jason, what you've observed in the broader society with regard to receptiveness toward progress is a phenomenon that I've observed within the transhumanist community, that somewhere around the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, a kind of greater techno-skepticism, more of a precautionary mentality set in. If you compare the two versions of the Transhumanist Declaration, the 1998 version versus the 2009 version, you'll find the 2009 version has a lot more cautionary language about some of the potential downsides of accelerating technological progress. And a lot of people talk about that. Some of these are legitimate warnings to heed, but it does seem like if the preponderance of social commentary is about that, there needs to be some sort of countervailing discourse that is more techno-optimistic. And so I was a transhumanist since I found out about the philosophy, also in the mid 2000s, circa 2004. And I would say I was an implicit transhumanist before then. But then the leadership of the Transhumanist Party kind of fell into my lap after Zoltan finished his run for president. And he decided essentially to move to the next stage of his career. And he asked me to head the Transhumanist Party. And I realized, well, this is the potential to reintroduce some of that techno-optimistic spirit into the transhumanist community. And I'm a bit less sensationalist than Zoltan. I'm also not willing to tour the country in a modified RV that has been turned into a coffin-shaped bus, although he did that to great effect. And he worked extraordinarily hard to do this. I'm not willing to put in those kinds of hours, but I am willing to undertake a kind of more systematic intellectual transformation of the movement itself into something more techno-positive. So essentially for me, it became a situation of, if not me, then who? I've observed some of the same kind of decline within the institutions in the movement, and I realized we need some institution that consistently stands for a techno-optimistic vision. And de facto, the Transhumanist Party has become it, to the point where I have to say this needs to be maintained, because we're kind of the bastion of this thinking in our movement.
Yeah,
but we're happy to find others, individuals and organizations to ally with in these areas.
The only other really active transhumanist organization is, I mean, at least in the U.S., is Humanity Plus, but they're a little bit different in that they have like a membership fee, and they're a little more. It's more academics. Whereas if you look at the people who are active in the USTP, it's a very wide range of people. We like to say we have a lot of working class transhumanists instead of, like, ivory tower intellectuals. But yeah, basically, even though we're not really getting anywhere politically, the USTP is important, you could say, relatively, just as one of the only transhumanist organizations that's actually active in the U.S. So
yeah, sure.
Yeah, but we definitely take heed to all of the things we're aware of a lot of the pitfalls and issues you mentioned, and I'd love to see other organizations. It's just like focusing on education or policy. It's just no one's picked up the reins yet.
Let me, if I may, take this on a bit of a tangent, because I'd like to riff on something that you said earlier about, you were just talking about risk and people putting more emphasis on risk, and maybe, I know there's a whole community now that emphasizes existential risk within the rationalist and effective altruist community. So let me try to frame that a little bit from because I've spent some time thinking about how do we what is the reconciliation perhaps of techno-optimism and a fundamental belief that technology can make things better and we should drive things forward with without a blind or kind of Pollyannaism or kind of just like, oh, everything's going to be fine, don't worry, because you have to, I mean, from just a basic rational level, you have to say, hey, look, there is an existential threat to the human species, or even something that would, knock us back to the Stone Age or something. We should really pay attention to that, right? Like, you don't want to just kind of cavalierly dismiss any such thing, without really looking into it. So here's the kind of the view that I've come around to, and that I think the framing that's helpful to think about these things. Safety is the key. Okay, so the key idea is this: safety is not a passive default that we risk upsetting through our actions. Safety is a goal that needs to be actively pursued and engineered. And the nature of technology is that some technology creates risk and some technology creates safety. And so I think just as technology is not inherently good or evil, technology is also not inherently safety creating or safety destroying, or risk creating or risk destroying. Now, I think what leads people to associate technology with risk is the fact that I think technology is maybe risk creating by default. That is, it is risk creating unless we consciously pay attention to risk and actively engineer safety. When we simply pursue goals other than safety, such as more power in our machines, more speed in our vehicles, more activity of various types in our medical treatments and so forth, those types of things always carry a risk of unintended side effects, right, or runaway effects or whatever. However, I think the record also shows that when we actively attempt to engineer safety, we can create it. And I think you see that in, faster vehicles leads to more vehicle risk, right? When we invented the car, we accidentally invented the car crash. But the record of auto safety is that it's actually been increasing over it's been on a long, auto accidents per vehicle mile or per passenger mile have been on a long downward trend ever since the early 20th century, whenever this stuff started to get tracked. And that's because we invented seatbelts and airbags and anti-lock brakes. And by the way, many safety inventions are not conventional inventions. They are policies and procedures. We invented the driver's license. We invented driver's ed. We invented stoplights and divided highways and, and so on and so forth. All these different things that have made things better. There's a similar thing in aviation safety, which has a really excellent culture of root cause analysis and putting in place, fixes to after a crash. Medical safety, we've greatly improved our policies and procedures around how we test treatments and make sure they really work and look for side effects and so on and so forth. I think one thing we learned from the history of safety is that a lot of the history of safety has been very reactive. We don't do a lot until there are accidents and disasters and people die. And then we look at what happened or what is happening and we do something. I think if it is... if it's true that, and I think there's a good argument that, the more powerful our technology, the more we could be creating extreme tail risks, very low likelihood events that have very high effects. I mean, I think you can see this in, for example, the history of war, where, war has been getting more rare and the average war, the median war has been getting less deadly. But then also in the 20th century, we got the world wars, which were, some of the most deadly ever. And of course, we also then created the possibility for a nuclear war, which could be by far the most deadly ever. So the more you're in this, kind of Nassim Taleb range where you've got these really big tail risks that you can't just look at the history and say, well, everything seems fine. And you're, like this is the classic, the Thanksgiving turkey thing where everything seems fine right up until the moment where you die. To the extent that those risks exist and are created by technology, more so than they exist in nature, I think that we need to get better at proactively. We need to get better at proactively assessing risk rather than reactively assessing it. Right? We need to get better at predicting risk. And by the way, I think predicting risk is also a thing that historically we've not been very good at. If you look at what people worry about when new technology is coming out versus what is actually the problem with new technology, I think those things are not highly correlated. People worry about all sorts of stuff. Very often there are moral panics and so forth. And then what turns out to actually kill you is, oops, X-rays cause cancer and radiation burns and sickness. Whoa, we didn't know that, right? But that's not the kind of thing people were worried about, when that technology was first coming out. And then there's a bunch of things people worry about that are actually not a big deal at all. Like, which very often takes the case of the form of moral breakdown in society, or even when it's not moral, it takes the form of like, the soot from the locomotives is going to blacken all the sheep and the cars are going to scare all the horses, and a little bit of that happened and so forth. But so we need to get better at actually predicting risk rather than just worrying about things that aren't correct and missing the things that are going to kill us. We also need to get better at actually doing something about it when we correctly predict the risk. So for instance, antibiotic resistance is the type of thing that was not unforeseen. Alexander Fleming famously sort of warned about this before the age of antibiotics, really got kicked off. Fleming, by the way, was the microbiologist who discovered the action of penicillin, or the penicillium mold, and that it was secreting a chemical that worked against bacteria that eventually turned into the other researchers eventually turned that into the penicillin drug. And so Fleming saw that, ooh, yeah, we could get a biological arms race here, and we'd get antibiotic resistance evolving. That did not stop people from massively overprescribing antibiotics during the 30s and 40s, especially 40s and into the 50s, and kind of when the golden age of antibiotics, when these things were coming out, they were just being hailed as miracle drugs, which they sort of were, but they were getting prescribed for everything. Acne, maybe antibiotics would do it. Like, oh, you got a headache, let's try antibiotics. I might be slightly exaggerating, but not very much. It was kind of that bad, because these were like the first drugs that really worked, in a major way, and were effective against a wide range of diseases. And so people were just trying them for everything. So we have to get better at predicting the right things. We have to get better at actually heeding the predictions. I think the thing about these risks is that they tend to be domain specific. That the wrong response to technological risk is to say, well, let's just put the brakes on technology as such, because then not only are you're putting the brakes on all of the massive benefits that technology creates, you're also putting the brakes on what allows us to respond to any unforeseen disaster in the future, whether it's man-made or natural. The enormous explosion of wealth and knowledge and technology and infrastructure and science is like a fundamental bulwark against any risk of the future. The richer we are, the smarter we are, the more we know, the more infrastructure we have, the better we are equipped to deal with anything that could possibly come our way. Again, whether it's of our own doing or not. One of the best writers on this, by the way, and writers against the precautionary principle, is David Deutsch. And so for people who haven't checked him out, highly recommend the book, The Beginning of Infinity, which has a lot of great, just philosophical take on this idea. And he points out that if we look at past civilizations, even ourselves, just, even Western civilizations just a couple hundred years ago, and we think about what did they know, what were they able to foresee, and what resources did they have at their disposal? The notion that they should be slowing down in order to protect us today is completely ridiculous, and the exact opposite, right? The notion that they would have any idea of what the risks are that they ought to be protecting against is completely wrong. They had no idea, even if we think we know today. They certainly didn't know 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So the notion that we can protect our descendants by slowing down and predicting the right risks is just like, at no point in history was that ever the right thing to do. In fact, he even flips the precautionary principle on its head to say that if we applied the precautionary principle to the past, there is no point in the past at which applying the precautionary principle was the right thing for our ancestors to have done, and therefore we should be cautious against applying it today, because if it never worked in the past, then an abundance of caution would say not to apply it now, and instead just to barrel forward heedlessly with technological development, which is exactly what was always the right thing to do in the past. So again, I don't think we want to go into this completely blindly. I do think that the creation of safety, including safety against our own technology, is one of the big achievements of technological progress. And so we should keep that going. I consider safety technology to be sort of, one of the major areas of technology that we should continue to do. We should continue to make life safer. But we don't do that by just applying the brakes to technology or to progress broadly and generally. We do it in very domain-specific ways by identifying risks of new things and then devising targeted strategies against them, such as RCTs in medicine, such as seatbelts and airbags, and so forth. And so that's what we need. We need a lot more domain-specific, correct prediction about technologies and targeted strategies against them. And I'm hoping that we are actually seeing that. And the two areas where I think we're starting to see that are artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, which are two of the frontier technologies that have enormous promise for mankind, and also have people actively worrying right now about what are the risks. So I think the fact that we have people, even before AI has truly arrived, we have people working on kind of specific problems like value alignment is good. I think the fact that in genetic engineering, we have twice now had cases where genetic researchers themselves called for a temporary moratorium on research until they could get together and work out safety protocols, I think is good. So the most famous of these was the 1975, I believe, Asilomar conference, which was so right after recombinant DNA technology was sort of invented, and like Genentech was getting started and stuff, right around that time. And basically people got together at this conference to work out safety protocols. And again, they did so in a targeted way by identifying a handful of specific risk levels, how you could identify what types of activities were at different risk levels, and then what protocols and procedures were appropriate to take at different levels. So they, again, a very domain-specific and targeted approach to identifying and countering risk. And so I think that's the kind of thing we need, and I think we're starting to see, and should encourage. But the domain-specific approach rather than the broad, like the degrowth or, hey, everybody, let's just slow everything down. I think that's not the right way to approach risk.
Yes, and I agree with you in this regard. I also think people have a tendency toward risk aversion. In fact, in my personal life, I've been told by some that I am one of the most risk-averse people that they've met. And yet, I also see great risks and stagnation from a technological and societal standpoint. The fact is, nuclear war is a huge existential risk right now, and we are also sitting ducks for asteroids, supervolcanoes, pandemics, as we're all well aware. So it is important to be proactive in anticipating risks, but also developing new technologies to overcome the many risks that exist today. So now I would like to go around the U.S. Transhumanist Party panel and see if our officers have questions for Jason, and then we will take some questions from the audience. So David Shoemaker, let's begin with you.
Yeah, thanks. Jason, really glad to have you here today. And I wrote down notes on a number of your different topics that I'll be looking at later. But one of the things that we've talked about has been the nature of the U.S. Transhumanist Party going forward. But I want to parallel that to you walking away from perhaps a lucrative IT career to take on this particular passion. So you have decided to take a different approach based on your passion, I would imagine, your interests. Those interests, I suppose, are probably very broad. How do you focus or target what it is that you want to take on? Because I think I see perhaps something parallel there for the Transhumanist Party. We have a lot of things that we would like to see change as we move forward. And we clearly have, limited resources, time, people, money, as I'm guessing that you do. So if you'd kind of like to speak to how you decided to move forward and how that's working, and if there's any wisdom there that you could pass on to us.
Yeah. So let me address this a bit at the meta level first, which is I think that we've been talking a lot about general strategy, but I think that when it comes, at the end of the day, every individual has to decide what are you going to devote your resources to, your time, energy, money, and so forth, and to what degree. And I think especially when it comes to devoting some portion of your career to something, it's actually a very personal decision and is not the right thing. It's not at all the same answer for anybody. In addition to these general strategy questions we've been discussing, every individual has to also ask themselves, what can I bring and what can I uniquely do? And people are different. They have different interests and different abilities and so forth. Something I was thinking a little early when you were talking about, I guess it was Zoltan's driving around in a coffin-shaped, RV. I was thinking, you know what? Some people just have a knack for publicity, and they have a knack for getting attention. And I was thinking, what we need is we need someone who's pro-progress and also is just naturally like a YouTube star, right, or a TikTok, star or something like that, right? And there are actually some people like that right now campaigning for nuclear technology, which is great. So, for me personally, I decided to go into this. It was a very personal decision. And it was based on, one, just being personally fascinated with and obsessed with the story of progress. When I started, I decided to approach it in a very bottom-up empirical, type of way, starting with history, rather than dive into, I was interested in, the title of my blog is The Roots of Progress, and that indicates a search for deep causes. But rather than go straight to the theory level, I decided to start with the history. I like to say that before you can explain why, say, the Industrial Revolution happened, you need to understand what happened in the Industrial Revolution. And it turns out that's a complicated question with a lot of answers that is very hard to find the answer to. And so essentially what happened to me was I went out looking for a book that would answer this question, and I couldn't find one. And so now I have to write it. Because it turns out the answer is out there. It's just spread over like a couple of hundred books, and you need to find the 5 pages in each of 100 different books that answers one piece of the question and then put it all together. Now, I personally, I got personally fascinated by this question, and I also, it turns out I like writing, and I think I have a knack for it. And so when I started to see that people were enjoying my writing, and that it could, an article that I wrote over a weekend or two could go viral. And in fact, not only that, but that it was shared even by professional economists and economic historians. And so the people who do this for a living liked something that I was able to do on my weekends. And so that told me that maybe maybe I'm onto something here. And so I think it was just the right combination of a personal passion, some apparent skill that I had that was relevant in a particular domain at writing, and then a perceived need in the world that I saw this progress community forming, and I saw myself gaining an audience. And so I realized, okay, there's something at the intersection of these things, what I love to do, what I can do, and what the world seems to be interested in. And so I think every individual and probably every organization needs to find something at the intersection of those three. What are you actually passionate about? What do you care about? What can you actually be great at and even best in the world at? And then what does the world need, and what is there some sort of a market for? This framework, by the way, a version of this framework came up in one of Jim Collins' books about business. I think it was Good to Great. But it might have been Built to Last. But in one of his books, he talks about this framework and the intersection of these three things. And I think it also kind of works for an individual pursuing a career. So I think that is really how, there is, I think you do want to think about abstract strategy, and you want to think about theories of change. There is something to be said for seizing a moment and taking advantage of a concrete opportunity in front of you. And so, Gennady, I understand what you're saying of this opportunity fell in your lap. You felt like you wanted to grab this thing that had, certainly there's a, if nothing else, there's a mailing list, there's a following, there's a bunch of people who are, listening now who are interested in behind this, and you don't want to let that dissolve and kind of that social unit go to waste. So, applaud your efforts to do the best that you can with it. But I think, think about how to leverage what you got, how to leverage your interests, your resources, the audience that you have, and the particular skills and passions of you, the leadership and the board who's sitting here. What can you all do? What are you good at? And if you're good at holding salons like this and getting an audience for them, then that's the thing to do. It even comes down to the choice of medium. I do more writing than anything else because that's what I like and that's what I think I'm good at. Other people make videos. Other people, the other thing I do is I tweet. So but again, it's very personal. It's just like, I love Twitter and I spend too much time on it. So why not make that it's the medium that I understand and I'm a native in, right? And have steeped myself in. And you really have to steep yourself in a medium in order to produce it well, right? So, go with, so find that intersection of those kind of more concrete and tactical things that are personal and individual, and then the general strategy and all these other ideas that we've talked about like kind of what are the big problems in the world. To look at it another way, it's a challenge of finding, both what are the big problems in the world and also the what can I uniquely contribute. I guess if you go, so another kind of framework to think about is 80,000 Hours is this effective altruist group that gives advice to people on how to think about your career and how to actually make a big impact. And the effective altruists talk about an intersection of important, tractable, and neglected. So, what would actually have a big impact if you succeeded? Where does it actually seem like you might be able to succeed? And then what is a thing that's not already getting a ton of attention, maybe proportional to those others? And you can go a little bit wrong with focusing too much on the neglected, because then as soon as some important, tractable thing gets a bit of attention, people start saying, oh, it's not neglected, so I'm not going to work on it, when actually it needs a lot. Maybe 2 out of 3 of those is good enough, right? Important and tractable, important and neglected, or tractable and neglected, right? If you can get at least 2 of those, then like go for it. So it's not entirely individual in the sense of like, well, I'm just going to pursue butterfly collecting or philately because that's what was my passion. But you also want to find what's the intersection of my passion and ability with, no, but what is actually a big important thing in the world that would be great and is a really, this is the Richard Hamming approach. So Richard Hamming wrote this book, The Art of Doing Science and Engineering. There's this famous talk he gave turned into an essay called You and Your Research. And he explicitly advises people to go after, big important goals. Hamming used to like to talk to people and say, and ask them, what are the biggest problems in your field? And then the follow-up was, and are you working on them? And if not, why not? So I think it's important to try to work on big, important things, but do it in that way that leverages your unique strengths and assets.
Yes, thank you, Jason. And these are great insights, certainly ones we will endeavor to apply in the years to come. I would say a lot of the work that we focus on is important and neglected with regard to how tractable it is. Well, let's say we will try to make it more tractable over time. But now let's go to Art Ramon Garcia for his question.
Yes, there are certain technologies that seem to sort of fly under the radar. 2 that I can think of are quantum computing and cybernetic appendages. And no one really seems to have any objection to these types of technologies. So how can we leverage the fact that there is no objection to some technologies and use that to our advantage?
Interesting. The first thing I would think about in those areas is just sort of, again, forming a kind of domain-specific theory of what is needed for progress in those areas. So quantum computing, for instance, has some fairly major research labs, I think, working on it. Google's got an effort that seems to be making progress from I'm mostly an outsider. I don't know a ton about quantum computing. I read Scott Aronson's, blog every once in a while to kind of keep up with latest developments. But so it seems like there's some big things going on there. I would ask, is that coming along at a rate that we would expect it to come along as given the maturity of the field, or not? If so, then maybe it's all right. And, but if not, maybe then you want to diagnose, well, what is blocking progress here, right? And it may be a similar thing with the appendages. And then come up with kind of a domain-specific theory of, well, what would unblock progress? And I think that, you can do it in domains that have opposition. You can do it in domains that don't have opposition. Certainly, I think that's I don't think you want to, necessarily avoid the domains that have opposition. I think it's just a thing you want to take into account. Certainly, if a domain does not have opposition, then or even has some positive, sentiment in the culture around it, great. That's something you can leverage. But I think that would just have to factor into, again, your kind of domain-specific theory of progress in that area and how to achieve it.
I think this question feeds in well into a question from Micah Redding from our audience. He's also the U.S. Transhumanist Party advisor on religion. He says, I think people need to feel progress happening. That can be a movement growing, gaining attention, causing change, etc. But how do you keep that sense of progress going? And I think that goes back to the observation that someone who lived during the first 3/4 of the 20th century would have seen dramatic transformations in their lives, not just in terms of the availability of electronic devices, but in every aspect of day-to-day life. So how can one create this feeling of progress that laypersons will intuitively recognize?
Great question. I think there is a reinforcing cycle of progress between progress itself and ideas about progress. The more progress that people see, the more they believe in it, and the more they believe in it, the more we're going to get it in the future. Similarly, the more people don't believe in progress, the less of it we get, and then the less people actually believe in it. And, there's kind of a, what has technology done for us lately, type of question. So I think that when you have a reinforcing cycle like that, it means 2 things. One is that it means that there's a lot of inertia to such cycles. It's difficult to change any part of it because the other part is pushing against you. And so you have the sort of flywheel effect where you need to put energy or momentum into something very slowly, consistently over a long period of time, and you will build up momentum as in a flywheel. And so there's no single kind of like big bang moment where it changes rapidly because there's too much inertia for that. What this means is, so the downside of that is it's difficult to make change. But the prescription then is to make change, to push on both sides or all sides of the flywheel at once. So I think we can push both on ideas and interpretations about progress, and I think we can push also on actually making progress. I think one of the best things that could happen for the world right now would be if there were some amazing breakthrough, if we did discover the secret to longevity, or if we were allowed to create, the nuclear future, or if, things along those lines. I'm really excited about the return of supersonic passenger travel and so forth, right? I think those sorts of things, people see them and they say, they can say, oh, technology is making our lives better. A CRISPR cure for cancer, for instance, would be great. That's the kind of thing where people say, oh, maybe we can make the world better. And where, again, the people who are most important to inspire are that tiny minority who are actually going to be the leaders, and even the sort of the foot soldiers in the organizations that are making the next generation of breakthroughs. And so I think inspiring those people is good. And I know that Boom Supersonic and its founder Blake Scholl, and folks like Elon Musk and so forth, those people are inspiring younger people today to say, wow, you can do big, ambitious technological things. I'm going to think about that. And so I think that's great. At the same time, I think we cannot get away with only having the concrete examples of progress if the entire intellectual tide is against progress. And so we need both. We need an intellectual vanguard that is explaining and justifying progress and head-on confronting the real costs and risks and trade-offs of progress and helping people think about those, and to sort of explain and justify the things that are going on in terms of actually making progress. So we need both of those to happen at once, and any way we can help on either side of that equation, I think is going to help. I've chosen to throw my weight onto the intellectual side and the explanation, the history and philosophy of progress. But I think at the same time, other people need to throw their weight onto the actually just making progress, whether people believe in it or not. And it's those two things working together that will actually change the world and get us back on a progress track.
Yes, indeed. And I would like to note, Elon Musk has single-handedly done a great deal for kind of reinvigorating the sense of progress happening in the general society with SpaceX, with Tesla, with Solar City, with the Hyperloop, which has kind of been outsourced to other entities, but there are trials of it occurring throughout the world. So that's an example of creating this tangible sense of progress. But I agree that having a culture that embraces it is also crucial, because it seems in the last 4 years especially, the cultural receptiveness to progress unfortunately has declined because of a lot of this partisan trench warfare that we see in the United States especially. So hopefully that can be reversed. But we have great examples of innovators who are helping with the practical side of things. Now, Dan, let us see if you have a question for Jason.
Oh, well, you read my mind actually, because yeah, I did have a question actually, which going way back to when we were discussing the political angle. I do think that policy is, or my sense is that policy comes a lot through lobbyists and people on Capitol Hill rather than, say the voting masses just demanding something. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on like creating a think tank? Because we've been in discussions with people actually about who wanted to start a transhumanist think tank or some kind of optimistic, techno progressive think tank. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
or also lobbying organization. I don't really know anything about lobbying, but
sure.
maybe.
Neither do I, frankly. I mean, could work. I think it's a matter of looking at specific areas that need help, and I would start with the ones where it is widely acknowledged that there is a problem, right? Start with some of the areas where it's and not only that necessarily, but like that certainly helps, right? If you have to begin by even convincing people there's a problem or that they should care or focus on something, it's not, that is the sort of thing that I feel is more of a like an intellectual outreach kind of idea focused organization, less so than policy. My impression is that policy can mostly get done on the things where a problem is widely acknowledged. But then go in whatever areas you pick, sort of go into them, form your domain specific theory of what is wrong and what is and how could they change, and then act according to that basis. So if it is the sort of thing that's primarily going to be some think tank comes up with a white paper or a policy proposal or report or whatever, and then it gets communicated to staffers on Capitol Hill, some lobbyist pushes for it, and somebody introduces a bill in committee and so forth. Like if that's the way some change is going to happen, then great, make it happen that way. I mean, I do think that popular support or opposition for things is not irrelevant to politics, but it's also not as simple as what actually gets done in politics is not as simple as just what do people support or oppose. So,
I mean, there wouldn't be, yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jason. Now we do have a few more questions from the audience. Do you have a little bit of additional time to address a handful more questions?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Okay, so there is a question related to what we just discussed from user Zinkson, who asks, what about getting transhumanist-friendly candidates into the Republican and Democratic parties, perhaps eventually creating some congressional caucus? And, well, we in the U.S. Transhumanist Party have some definite thoughts on that, but Jason, we are wondering what your thoughts are on that approach.
Yeah, I don't really know. I'm not a great political strategist, and I work much more at the sort of ideological and intellectual and cultural level. I mean, from one standpoint, it seems that the U.S. naturally gravitates to a two-party system, so maybe going in through one of the two major parties is the only way to do it. That also sounds intractable to me. I have no idea how you would get. I mean, the Republican Party just seems absolutely lost to ideas, and I think Trump proved that by just coming in and swiftly taking over on the basis of, as far as I can tell, no real philosophy or ideology at all, just a certain kind of popular appeal and attitude and personality. But at the same time, I wouldn't expect the Democratic Party to have, to be any easier to get influence in or traction, on with these sorts of ideas. So I keep coming back to, I don't see an opportunity right now for broad political action in the sense of at the level of political parties and candidates. I see potential for that there might be something to do, some traction to get tractability at the level of specific issues, policies, and programs if they can be pitched and pushed in the right way. But in terms of a general, candidates and platforms are about general philosophies, and I just feel that where the country is right now and where the major parties are right now, it's just too far away. And that's why I focus more on the intellectual activism.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for your response. And we do see a lot of the same obstacles that you've pointed out within the Republican and Democratic parties. So we've essentially said we're open to pragmatic collaboration with any politician from any party on issue-specific bases, but we wouldn't go so far as to try to infiltrate another political party. Also because we recognize we would be a drop in the bucket within that political party, and a lot more established and savvy operatives will just outplay us, to be frank. So I'd rather focus on creating a distinctive identity within politics that advocates for technological progress. Now, here's a question from Daniel Twett, which is interesting. He asks, how do we stop sociopaths from weaponizing progress? And I think he speaks to a common concern that many have of technology falling into the wrong hands or people using it for evil. I suppose one of the best examples in history is Adolf Hitler, but that's kind of a stereotyped example. What do you think the level of risk of that happening is going forward? Do you think humankind has largely addressed that risk already? And if it remains a risk, how would one safeguard against it?
Yes, there is this saying, I forget who it's from or the exact phrasing, but something about the level of IQ needed to destroy the human race drops by, X points per decade. I forget what it was. And that, at some point it's going to hit the level where anybody can do it, and then maybe we're goners. I go back to my general framework on risk, which is that is domain specific. And so I don't think there's an answer at the general level of how do we keep a sociopath from destroying the human race. I think there is an answer to how do we make nuclear technology safe and prevent nuclear proliferation. I think there's an answer to how would we prevent against a bioengineered pandemic. There's an answer to, et cetera. So you have to figure out what the risks are. And then, for pandemics, a lot of the answer is probably similar to how we respond to natural pandemics, which is good because those happen anyway. So we might as well, beef up against them. I think the fact that we now have a new vaccine platform in mRNA technology is extremely good because it means we can develop new vaccines much faster, against new pathogens. Maybe bioengineered pandemics would have a different character that we would have to specifically think about ahead of time and guard against. But the answer is going to be very specific to that domain. So, with nuclear, one of the interesting things, I'll come back to the book, Where is My Flying Car? It's had a lot of discussion about potential nuclear technologies, and some of them specifically, the author remarked, were kind of robust against proliferation because they could not be used for, to create weapons, basically, right? And so maybe that's part of the answer with nuclear, is that we need to spread nuclear tech, but only of the type that can't be used as weapons. So enumerate the domains and come up with specific answers for each one. That's my basic answer.
Great.
Also, by the way, being a multiplanetary species might help. That's the one thing that I think could be like a generic, risk mitigation strategy, right? Is to just like expand. The more places we're in and the farther apart they are, the more kind of generally distributed and robust we are. We've got a central point of failure right now. That's this planet, and that's central points of failure are not good. So,
absolutely. Well, perhaps we can colonize Europa sometime in the near future, and we wholly support the goal of becoming a multiplanetary species. Advocacy for space colonization is part of the U.S. Transhumanist Party platform as well. So now for a final audience question. This one is a bit amusing, from Mike Lazine. He asks, does anybody think Back to the Future 2 hover cars are not doable besides me? And it's interesting to note Back to the Future 2 took place in 2015. So we should already have had those kinds of hover cars. And I'd be interested in your take on this question, Jason, particularly because you reviewed the Where is My Flying Car book recently. So do you think the Back to the Future 2 vision of flying cars can be realized?
Yeah, so the hover car in particular, maybe not. I mean, that was a fanciful thing. There's no physical theory behind how the hover car works, to my knowledge. But flying cars in general, as what is a flying car, by the way? We had an interesting discussion on Twitter about this. I think the key elements of a flying car is that it obviously it flies, that it is broadly accessible to most people, right? Which means that the cost is within the reach of most people, and whatever training it takes, to operate it is within the reach of most people, just like automobiles are. And then the last thing is that it takes you directly from point A to point B. You eliminate the need to go to a station and where you can take off, right, and then fly from there to another station. Or at least there's an argument that says that as long as you can take one vehicle to the nearest takeoff point and then drive that same vehicle, at least you don't need three vehicles to get to where you're going, right? The car that takes you to the airport, the plane, and then the car that takes you from the airport, right? That's the three vehicle problem. And then the last thing about a flying car is that it's personal rather than mass transit, right? So you don't have to catch some vehicle that is leaving on a schedule and go on the vehicle's schedule. You can go on your own schedule by just leaving. The vehicle's accessible whenever you want it. It takes you straight from point A to point B. So those are the defining characters of a flying car. Before I read the book, I didn't necessarily think this is actually a good idea. And one of the things the book changed my mind on is making me think, oh, we actually really need this. And so there are various types of technologies that could make this happen, from convertible cars that sort of have wings that attach or unfold, et cetera, to, vertical takeoff and landing, something that's more like a helicopter or more like an enormous drone, like we have the quadcopters today. I don't know anything about aviation engineering, so I have no idea what's the most feasible. But the book "Where Is My Flying Car" did convince me that this was a good idea and we should go after it, because today air travel is basically at the same place that ground travel was when we only had locomotives and didn't have the automobile. You have the last mile problem, and you have the mass transit problem of needing to catch a mass vehicle on an inconvenient schedule. And so I do think that flying cars, actually, I'm feeling this right now because I am wringing my hands and racking my brain about whether and how I can safely visit my parents for Christmas across the country. And my wife and my brother and I are all talking about this, and I'm not sure we can do it. If so, it's going to be an enormous hassle. But so much of that is around the exposure from travel. If we had a flying car, and all we need to do was quarantine ourselves for 2 weeks, make sure we didn't have any symptoms, maybe get a COVID test, and then take our flying car across the country, this would be problem solved. And in fact, we're looking right now at a whole bunch of people who seem to be planning travel and gatherings for Thanksgiving at a time when the cases per day of COVID are at an all-time high, and we're just on an enormous third wave right now if you've been looking at the numbers. And if you can just think about the safety that flying cars would create for us from this pandemic, you get why, coming back to this thing, we need progress to create safety. Right? And we cannot foresee or predict the exact ways in which more wealth, more technology, more science, knowledge, and infrastructure is going to create safety for us. But it does, because it creates power and options, right? And so it does create risk, but it also creates new ways to get around unforeseen risks, and I mean, just think where we would be right now if we didn't have mRNA technology, if we didn't have genetic technology in general, right? And the ability to synthesize genetic material and the ability to sequence it and so on and so forth, right? All of that foundation is what has allowed us to create a COVID vaccine in record time. If you haven't looked at the history, typically it takes a decade or more to create a vaccine after you identify the pathogen. And now we've done it in basically, a year. Which is really amazing. So yeah, I think we need flying cars. And if you don't think that we need them like I did just a few months ago, go read my review of Where Is My Flying Car on my blog, Roots of Progress, and then go read the book.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jason. And I completely agree. We need technology to improve our safety, to make possible safe interactions that wouldn't otherwise be possible. I shudder to think what would have happened had this kind of pandemic with this kind of pathogen occurred, say, in the year 1990. I think humankind would have been dealing with this menace of COVID-19 for years and probably would not have quite eradicated it even over the course of decades. So I am glad we're living in this time to deal with this pandemic. But yes, hover cars, flying cars more generally would have been great for travel. I essentially have to consider any sort of long distance travel right now to be beyond my risk tolerance. And I think many people are in that situation. But what if technology could allow direct access from point A to point B? So thank you very much, Jason. And now it has come to the closing remarks. So if you would like to sum up the discussion or provide any further insights about where these ideas can be taken from here, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, let me just close with something that I haven't said yet, but I think is very relevant to you all, which is that I think when most people think about the intersection of scientific and technological progress and government, the first thing they think about is funding for science, and the most obvious thing is to give more of it. And so encourage all of you to think about these and read up on these arguments about scientific freedom and the concerns that the way we fund science today may actually be doing significant amounts to harm the progress of science. And so, it's possible that the last thing we need is another 10 or $100 billion given to the NSF or the NIH or whoever, as well-intentioned as that might be on everybody's part. It may be that that's actually not the thing that creates progress. And what we need to do is look at structural issues like, can we break apart the monopoly of the NIH and split its functions maybe into multiple competing groups that take different approaches, strategies, and philosophies, or even to some degree privatize it, such that we can get more experiments going on, less centralization and bureaucracy, less consensus and groupthink, and more ability to find unexpected breakthroughs. So that would be the thing that I would suggest that you all think about in terms of platforms and policies.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for this suggestion. And it is extremely important to consider whether some superficially good outcome might indeed lead to some negative secondary consequences. This has happened with nanotechnology funding, as you have pointed out. So hopefully it doesn't happen with funding for aging research or rejuvenation biotechnology. So thank you very much, Jason, for joining us today. I think we had a fascinating conversation about the roots of progress, how to accelerate progress, theories of political and cultural change, and further areas for us to explore as an organization. And I will say to our viewers, please tune in next Sunday, November 29th, for a special virtual Enlightenment Salon, where we will have guests from the transhumanist community discussing some ideas for future directions of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. This will be the public portion of our USTP summit. It will come the day after a closed executive session that we will have on Saturday, but our public portion will be open to member input. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation with all of you. And until then, live long and prosper.
Thanks so much for having me on. Great conversation.